Hi, and welcome back to my series on first-party data strategy. I'm Pete Neeson, and in episode 2, we're going to explore how to get started with a first-party data strategy. Let me start by sharing what I see as 4 essentials for every organization in forming their first-party data strategy. First is having an executive champion. The second is putting together an operational plan, then coordinating that with a platform plan, and finally having a maturity plan which links all of these together and allows you to communicate to the organization. Let's look at what an executive champion needs to consider in order to chart a path forward. And I say executive champion because a first-party data transformation goes really to the top of the organization. It's going to require broad collaboration across the organization, and it's going to have impact at the very highest level. So getting a C-suite level executive involved early is important. If you are that C-suite level executive, your involvement and your steering and management of this early is going to help accelerate the process. Now, in any transformation, there's more than one aspect. And in a first-party data transformation, the 3 that we really need to focus on are the technical aspect, the operational aspect, and the cultural aspect. Now, before we start getting overwhelmed with all of those different implications, let's just look at the end game for each one and where we're trying to chart a path to and try and keep it simple in that sense. If we first look at the technical aspect, the future state, the end game there is to have a first-party data platform in place. And this is your first-party data platform, which you have assembled over time and functions to help your organization operate the way that it needs to. You will also need to bring in new skills, maybe new people or just training people to be able to use that platform, but the end game itself is the platform. The second aspect, the operational aspect, the future state and end game there is really to form a virtuous data cycle, one that feeds itself and helps grow the investment by taking in data, using that data, enriching your ability to get more data, and engaging customers further. And the last aspect, culture. The end game and future state here is really aligning to customer lifetime value. When an organization can all align to customer lifetime value in terms of a macro metric, a way to steer and prioritize activities, then you're reaching that maturity on a cultural level. Okay, let's take a look at a checklist that champions can use and revisit over time to help make sure that they're looking at all of the different components of a plan that's going to help the transformation progress. First, start by knowing the opportunities and imperatives of first-party data. You're going to have to bring more champions on board and be able to articulate that. So spend a little bit of time learning different components of first-party data and how it can bring value to the organization, as well as those ticking clock imperatives. Second, start connecting early with collaboration partners. This transformation is obviously going to require many people to work together, and we think about the different aspects, the technical aspect. Well, executives there, maybe the CMO is going to have to work very closely with the CTO or the CIO. We think about the operational aspect. In a B2B world, I see, CMOs and CDOs working with head of sales all the time. Start those partnerships as early as possible, because when everybody feels like they're contributing to this and they are part of the development of the first-party data plan, it's a whole lot easier to keep momentum going. Now, third, and this is really important, this is how if you were to say the one thing you need to get started, it is finding a path to value. Now, we're going to spend a whole episode on paths to value, different paths to value, and how you can articulate them as well as build a business value case around them. But what I mean by a path to value here is a larger transformation happens in steps, as we all know when we've been through transformations. And we have to fuel that transformation by delivering value to the organization. It might be cost savings, it might be new revenue growth. So we're going to have to find a set of use cases and some problems to solve that is small enough that it's going to deliver value early, help us bring on new capabilities, help us change our operations a little bit, and take one step further towards a culture of customer lifetime value. And we are going to do it in those incremental stages. So finding and then validating that path to value. Do a business case. Make sure that there really is the opportunity that you think is there, and give it a level of effort assessment as well. Because sometimes the biggest opportunity isn't necessarily the one you want to go after first, right? That can be really difficult from a level of effort standpoint. So find the right balance between value and level of effort, and find that one or two things that you can focus on as your path to value to get this transformation rolling. And last, but certainly not least here, is defining a maturity plan. So you've got to start with some broad strokes around a maturity plan. How are you going to get from today's current state to that end game, end state that we talked about for each of those aspects? Okay, so as we see, for champions, there's some planning to do, and that checklist can be helpful. Here's a worksheet that I used recently, so I'll share it with you here with a customer, and we were just planning out and sort of plotting in a matrix format the different skill sets and qualities that different executives would bring as champions, because we had a team here that really wanted more than one executive to lean into this. So we looked at the values and imperatives that were really important to each executives, what sort of assets and tools they owned that they could be working with here, and also the paths to value for funding for them and who they would likely need to partner with. So this might be useful to you as a starting point. Feel free to use it. It could be something that you can use really to start planning for any type of executive and outlining what their priorities would be. Let's move on to essential number 2 for a first-party data strategy, which is an operational plan. The operational plan tells your teams what to do with the capabilities that the platform provides, as well as informing what capabilities you need and what capabilities you may need to upgrade. It's going to help you think about new ways to measure success and growth, and it's also going to support building a virtuous data cycle, which we're about to discuss. In the 2020s, your operations is all about data. Now that's a bold statement, but let me show you how I get there. In the digital marketplace, which we discussed in the previous episode, your operations and your growth are increasingly about digital spaces and providing digital pathways. In an experience economy, digital engagement success is rooted in great experiences and being able to personalize those experiences and ultimately the first-party data that allows us to personalize. So your brand's operations really is rooted in data. Data flow, data capture, and data collaborations are all part of it. Now, I know a lot of operational strategies start to think in terms of use cases. Now, the use cases are going to be different for each business, but what's broadly relevant for all use cases in the 2020s is that all operations are centered in data. So we're going to be discussing operations in terms of moving data around an organization, capturing it, collecting it, sharing it, collaborating on it, and that involves flow. We need to be looking at the flow. Across organizations I work with, there's basically 3 models that I can see most data flows grouped into. The first is the linear data flow, or data as a project. The second is an outsourced model of customer data and access, and this forms a broken loop or a vicious cycle. And the third that we're going to really focus on today is data as a process, also known as a virtuous cycle. So let's just take a quick look at each of these so you can understand where your organization may be and how to get out of that model into more of the virtuous cycle model. When we start with the linear data flow, we basically see in this project format, data gets pulled for a specific purpose. It then gets used for that purpose. We then try and drive revenue with it. We report on the success of that project, that campaign, whatever it happened to be. And when we move on to the next project, which probably starts with another data pull. This leads to a lot of data silos because that data was pulled and accessed in bespoke terms, and it wasn't necessarily left in a way that was easily accessible in the future. Then there's the outsourced customer data model. This forms a broken loop and it forms a vicious cycle. So we need to break this one as often as we can. What happens here generally is it starts out by saying, hey, I need to get a group of customers and I need to get access to data for that group of customers. So a third party is paid either through gaining a list or through advertising, and then we draw traffic from that advertising in that list. We optimize the messages to that traffic to move them around the organization, drive revenue, and then we report on the success of that initiative. But the loop isn't closed here because the lion's share of the data really goes to that third party. They get the richest part of this, and your first party data isn't really developed significantly because of it. We need to steer away from that model. The third model, and this is the one we're going to focus on here, is data as a process, and it forms a virtuous cycle. This is what we need to try to do to build rich first-party data and to grow that first-party data asset continuously. So let me share a data cycle model with you. I've used this with a lot of customers. They've started with us as a base and then customized it for their own needs. This is a 5-stage model. And what it's supposed to help you do is think of data as a cycle, not just a database. And that may sound pretty simple, but we need to internalize that idea, and that's part of a cultural shift that a champion is going to need to drive. The first-party data cycle, it has these discrete stages. It starts with collecting data, then connecting additional data sources, activating that data, enriching that data, and then optimizing that first-party data asset before we begin the cycle again with collecting more. The way to keep this a virtuous cycle versus a vicious cycle is to try and prioritize first-party data gathering and first-party data access of customers over third-party as often as possible. Now, that's not always going to be possible. There's plenty of times where it's appropriate, and really even the only way is to use third-party. That's fine, but again, we're trying to continuously improve. So if we can keep that idea of using our first-party data for access and always capturing first-party data when we are engaging with customers, we can keep this a virtuous cycle. Okay, taking a look at the first two stages of the data cycle, collect and connect. The collect is the operational phase in which we're ingesting visitors into the customer profile repository and matching their profiles when possible. And the aspirational maturity goal here over time is to get to a point where you're collecting a profile for every visitor to every digital property. Now, don't get hung up on that if you can't do it right away. You can take what you're able to do now and still engage in this cycle and benefit from it, and always come back to being able to enrich your collect capabilities as you mature. In the connect phase, we're always thinking about, are there more sources of data that I can add and connect to the customer profile repository to make it richer, to make it a more well-rounded view of that profile? Again, don't get hung up here. I mean, in 2021, I've seen estimates that most organizations are working with an average of between 15 and 20 different data sources for their customers. Don't pause here to connect all 15 to 20 data sources. Start with as many as you have connected today and start layering in those additional data sources over time, because we need to keep the business moving, and this is a continuous process. The third stage in the process is activate, and this is the phase where engagement and communications are triggered and received. And generally what we see for the use cases here is we're constantly trying to do better personalization in our outbound communication digital channels, email, mobile, the website, any communities you have, SMS. So when we're able to use that first-party data to personalize a message or an experience, that's the activation stage. And what we want to aspire here to in maturing is being able to do it across all channels and in more real time. Again, don't get stuck here if you're not able to do that today. Do what you can, but start connecting this full data cycle and continue on. The fourth phase is enrichment. This is where data profiles gain additional value by meshing and merging, and then sometimes just directly asking for data that fills gaps in your customer profile. And the way that really advanced organizations do this is they start by understanding what data is really valuable that they may have for some profiles and not for others, and prioritizing a way within their experiences to gain that data. This enrichment phase is where we start asking a lot of questions of the data. We start querying the data. Data is most useful when we are able to query it, and that's why as part of the data cycle, specifically for marketers, we shouldn't just be looking at our functional analytics. How well is our campaign doing? How many clicks do we get? We need to be looking at the customer data and querying it. What are my best customers? What data is most important to get in each profile? Am I actively trying to collect that data in the right and appropriate journey? Every time you go through this cycle, try and add a little bit more to your enrichment, and you will begin building a virtuous cycle. Now, the last phase here is optimization, and it's the final stage, and it's also the stage in which the cycle begins again. And generally what we focus on here is identifying areas of improvement across the whole cycle, as well as identifying areas of improvement for how we can use the data more and better questions that we can ask of the data. In short, I like to think of this as the point where we pause and take a breath in our day-to-day operations and think about what's working well, what's not working well, and how do we get better at those things, and how do we systematically stop, think about it, and put new processes in place and allow people to share great processes that are working within the organization. Sharing and communicating insights is probably the most important part of this optimization phase. Once we pause to do that, then it's time to start thinking again about how we collect data better and begin the cycle again. So in the optimization phase, our aspirations for maturity here are to get to a point where we can start developing rich propensity models for customers and for experiences, as well as starting to tie everything into customer lifetime value. Now again, this is an iterative process, but it's really important that you pause here and have discussions about the last campaign you ran or the last journey that was launched, and talk about how does it help you build a propensity model? What questions are you asking and querying the data of because of that particular campaign? And how is your effort tying into understanding and building a better model for customer lifetime value? A quick example that I'll share with you here was working with a client recently. They had come to me and said, hey, we're ready to get some more advanced capabilities in the matching engine space. And that particular capability is something they wanted to build. They wanted to go to more of their digital properties. And that's great, and truly they were ready. But before we did that, we found some additional value that they could uncover in the very short term by pausing first and asking ourselves, have we done that optimization phase of the data cycle? Have we looked at the previous journeys and campaigns that you've been running and learned who are the most valuable prospects within that process? Who's responding really well to them? What data have we gathered that we didn't have 3 months ago that's really rich? And how do we make sure that when we deploy these new capabilities, we have thought about that new learning from the activate and the enrich phase, and make sure that when we launch this new capability, we've optimized our process a little bit more. That also allowed us to pause and talk about how the previous campaigns and journeys that they had run also did fit into customer lifetime value. We started to think and culturally about not just talking about the clicks of an email campaign and those behavioral analytics, but we started to talk about how it added X number of people to the database. And now the database, the profiles were 10% richer. Those are metrics of customer lifetime value, and just beginning to discuss them early, even if they aren't a part of your systematic process yet, that's how champions start to begin the cultural shift as well. A quick note on the enrich and optimize phase here as we wrap up on the data cycle. These are two real differentiating stages for brands. When you start to think about your platform and questions come up around build or buy, should we develop something internally, should we buy an available technology? If I can give you any advice that's worked well for many customers that I've worked with, is if you're going to develop something internally, focus on these two stages, because these are real differentiators. Whereas collect and connect and even activate, those tend to be sort of table stakes for everybody, and there's good technologies available there. But when you think about building propensity models, that's something that might be worth more focusing your development team's time on versus, say, developing a better email system or better data connections. Those things are available from vendors. So just some notes there as you think about it. We'll discuss a build versus buy strategy more in depth in a later episode. Here's just a quick summary of some of the basic principles that we talked about as you're creating a virtuous first-party data cycle. Prioritizing that customer access through your first-party channels, that's a really important one. I would encourage people to start with that one as soon as possible, specifically marketers. If somebody is in your database, why are you paying a third party to communicate with them? That's the first-party data access principle in short. But there's a couple other tips here. We've talked about some of them. The only one that I'll emphasize again here is that continuously testing, optimizing, and really growing that virtuous data cycle, that's what's important about operationalizing a first-party data strategy. You've got to do that to reduce dependencies on third parties, because your dependencies on third parties is what drives costs up and allows them to get a lot smarter about your customers. One last little cheat sheet for you here. Here's a list of some common goals that I've seen different clients that I've worked with write down and start to work towards. So let me just share a couple of those with you, and you might want to use some of these yourself. I'm sure you might add some as well, but it's a little cheat sheet for you in helping to maintain a virtuous first-party data cycle. The third thing we need in a first-party data strategy is, of course, the platform. These are the capabilities that allow us to capture, enrich, and leverage first-party data. So there's 6 core capabilities that make up a first-party data platform. You can debate how you want to name them, but this is generally what I've seen over time working with a lot of different customers. It all kind of boils down to these 6 capabilities. And we're using the term platform here because these capabilities, they need to be integrated and connected for bidirectional data flow. Each of these capabilities is critical in order to complete that first-party virtuous data cycle, but you can phase them in over time. Few people that I've worked with have all of these capabilities already. Many of them have some of these capabilities and they're looking to expand into new ones. Some of them are re-examining the capabilities they have to see if they are capable of performing in the digital marketplace, but you can layer these capabilities in over time. Your strategy for deploying these, it will be individual to your organization. But in the end, the platform that you come out with will be unique to you. No 2 brands have exactly the same configuration of a first-party data platform, and no 2 brands have the same strategy for using it. So let's dive into the capabilities. I'm only going to spend a little bit of time on each one because we could spend all day on each capability. The customer profile repository is the first one. Now this one is really critical and essential, and if you were to ask me if there's one capability that's maybe most important to start with, I would focus on this one. We use the term profile repository here because a mature system, it's going to include probably several different databases that function as this one customer profile repository. I'm going to spend a little bit more time in depth on this one at the end because there's a lot to think about here, and if you want to get started with this, which I encourage, there's a couple things that will be helpful to know. Okay, so the profile repository is where we keep our unknown and known profiles, but the profile matching engine is the next capability, and its primary function is to be able to match unknown to known profiles across all of your digital properties. And that's a key point. Don't just use your profile matching engine for your website. Think about any other digital properties in which you have unknown visitors. A quick tip here for marketers. Marketers too often focus and segment on just the known profiles, but keep in mind that those millions of unknown profiles, they are really rich with customer experience data, preferences, and insights in terms of who you should be targeting in the future. And you can gain a lot by looking at those unknown profiles as well as the known profiles. Channel orchestration is our third capability, and channel orchestration is what coordinates communications with customers across your digital channels. Now those channels might be email, mobile push, your website, SMS, communities, chat, social media, or any new channels that pop up over the coming years. But this channel orchestration is really how mature first-party data brands speak to customers. They make sure that the timing and frequency of messaging, the channel of preference, all of these are considered because that's what a good communicator does, and a good communicator as a brand will build trust with customers, which means that you'll get more data. Next is the recommendations personalization AI, and this is what makes all of that personalization of communications across the digital channels possible. And we use the scale and the speed that only really machine learning can provide to make sure that the engine matches the right message, content, and experience to the profile of the customer we're trying to engage. Now, most of us are familiar with recommendation engines, but really advanced AI in this area should be actually personalizing full experiences as well. The path someone takes digitally should be personalized to them, and the sequence of communication should be personalized to them as well. So think about that when you're looking at recommendation personalization AI. Content management systems have been the heart of the digital world for a while. There's been a lot written about them, so I won't spend too much time here. What you should be looking at for content management is something that connects to all of your digital channels so that you can coordinate personalized communication from your content repository to all of those digital channels. One recommendation I have for folks that I hear all the time, people saying, oh my goodness, if I have to personalize, it means I have to develop so much more new content. That's a lot of money and time and energy. Think more about developing small, discrete pieces, which can be mixed and matched in new permutations. That is just as effective often as developing new content itself. For instance there, had I followed my own advice, this video would not be one 20-minute chunk. It might be a series of 5 or 6 4-minute chunks in which could be mixed and matched in different ways to serve different people's needs and interests. So do as I mention here, not necessarily as I've done with this video when it comes to content management and development. Last but not least is analytics. Now, analytics are really important. Of course, we'd be flying blind without them, and if we're not measuring something, then we're probably not giving it the importance it needs. So analytics are something that I talk with almost every client about, but there's two layers of analytics really. There are those functional analytics which look at each of the capabilities we've been discussing and help you improve your email open rates, help you improve your content. They help you think about getting a better matching engine or helping your recommendation AI perform. So you want to look at analytics that are functional for each of those capabilities. But leaders in the digital marketplace today, they're really starting to look at more of the macro metrics, the experience metrics, those metrics that tell you how effective your customer experiences are and where people are following through with the flow of that experience. So moving beyond sort of static and rear view looking metrics like NPS and CSAT that don't give us a lot of information that we can react to and improve upon immediately, and looking towards metrics of journey completion. Where is journey dropout happening? What parts of the journey are people most happy and engaging with and effectively improving that way? That's what allows us to start moving towards more customer lifetime value-based metrics instead of just the behavioral metrics of our capabilities. Now, here's a quick view of how these capabilities overlay on the data cycle. It is not a one-to-one pairing, but this might be helpful as you're planning your data cycle and your operational strategy. It might help you think which of these capabilities might I be lacking and which capabilities can help me with each of those points in the data cycle. Okay, let's wrap up the platform section with a little bit more time spent on that customer profile repository. Now, generally when we think about the first-party data asset as one thing, we have to understand that it's really usually a composite of multiple databases. And the three I see most common are the marketing customer database, a CRM, sales-based customer database, and a services database. Now, some people layer in a loyalty database here as well. My personal opinion is that loyalty databases could probably be a layer within one of these other databases, but that's for you to decide. There's also the data lake to consider. Now, the data lake, in my experience, it's something that most organizations are starting to have, especially large organizations, but it doesn't really allow you to activate or access any of this data in a way that a first-party data asset should and needs to. So the data lake may be the basement where everything's kept, but when it comes to your first-party data asset, it's going to be much more of these functional activation databases. And you can start with any one of these being your primary source and expand to the others. But a myth I like to bust early on is that, B2C businesses don't really need CRM. I don't find that necessarily to be true. So you may not focus on CRM, you may not have a big CRM, but knowing how to coordinate all your partners, your vendors, all of those things, that's part of CRM and should be part of your first-party data asset. Likewise, in the B2B world, sometimes marketing databases aren't that big and people think they can use CRM to perform the functions of a marketing database. I'd also like to bust that myth as well, because a CRM is not set up to perform the capabilities that a marketer is going to need. It is also not set up to handle the capacity that a marketing database will need. So your first-party data asset will likely be a composite of these three databases, maybe some others. Focus on the one that is in your purview. If you're a CMO, that marketing database is really important. If you're head of sales, that CRM is probably really important. If you're head of services, that services database. Eventually, in a mature system, they will be connected and they will be able to share data across all three. But that's generally, when we talk about the first-party data asset, what it's comprised of. The next thing that we should just take a quick look at here is that first-party data asset and those individual databases which make it up. They're of course connected, but they are a part of the first-party data platform. All of the capabilities that we just talked about on the platform, they are performed against that first-party data asset. They're connected to that first-party data asset. And the last thing to sort of think about here, and another reason why there's generally more than one database that makes up the first-party data asset, is there's different roles that need to have access to and are part of enriching that first-party data asset. And an example I like to use, marketers. Marketers need to be able to speak to tens of thousands, millions, sometimes even billions of people. And the database that they need needs to be able to store records that can have many, many, many attributes for those millions and billions of people. That sort of data level would clog up a CRM. Marketers need their own database. They also need to be able to interact with that database, to segment and query that. And that's one of the biggest weaknesses I see, and a specific call out for CMOs to really address early on, is a lot of marketers are functioning without a database right now in the digital marketplace in which they can capture all of that data, but also get in there and query and make segments and start to put audiences into different tiers of customer lifetime value. And it's always surprises me, because you look at the investments that organizations have made and say logistics, and you wouldn't ask anybody to do modern logistics without an ERP system. But a lot of organizations are asking modern marketers to perform their task in the digital marketplace without a really up-to-date marketing database tool. So there's a little plug for CMOs and sort of making your case to get some updated tools for the repository there. This is just a look at the fact that we need different interfaces for these different databases, because a services rep is going to want to look at different things than a marketer would. And a services rep is going to look at individual records, whereas a marketer generally looks at cohorts, not individuals. Those are some things that hopefully will help you a little bit as you're thinking through, maybe visualizing and explaining that first-party data repository, which is so essential to your digital platform. Okay, we've come to the fourth essential in how to get started in the first-party data strategy, and that is the maturity plan. Now, the maturity plan really is a steering mechanism and a communications mechanism for the first-party champion as well as the team. And the maturity plan is there to coordinate your platform development along with your operation and execution plan. It's going to look at and coordinate the capability development and maturity over time, as well as your use case maturity and execution over time, as well as your KPIs and analytics over time. It's going to help you set expectations, build that alignment, awareness, and collaboration, and you'll likely find that it'll have a lot of detail in phase 1 as you get started and less detail in phase 2 and 3. That's fine. This is a tool for you to keep an overview. Here's a quick look at a template and some of the things that go into a good maturity plan. It, of course, is phased over time, but it addresses all three of the transformational aspects. The operational aspect, where we have things like your use cases mapped out and phased, as well as your data maturity mapped out and phased. Then there are those technical aspects, which phase out those technical capabilities over time, as well as how you're going to gain the expertise and potential training that might be needed for those new expertises over time. Then it looks at the cultural aspects, the KPIs, the insights, and the overall timeline and milestones of progress and your paths to value. So it helps a champion make sure that he or she is addressing all of those elements that are needed to make sure the transformation progresses and sticks. You can take a look at this. It has some examples. This is one, a maturity plan that I was recently working on with a customer. It's been sanitized here a little bit, but it might give you some ideas and help you get started. So feel free to take a look if that becomes helpful to you. Now, the last thing in terms of a maturity plan a lot of people ask is about a timeline. I can't give you a specific timeline, obviously, because your organization, all organizations move at different velocities. But there's a planning stage and there's an execution stage. It's generally what I see happen. And that planning stage, identifying the champion and putting together the basics of your platform and your strategy, operation strategy is a good idea. Doing the broad strokes of your maturity plan. And then it's time to kick off and start actually implementing your phase 1 maturity capabilities and operational use cases and phase 2 and phase 3. I suggest not spending too long in the planning phase because things change quickly, obviously, and you're going to update all of this as you go. But hopefully this helps you sort of give an overview of what this generally looks like. That brings us to the end of this episode. We just covered first-party data strategy and how to get started. In the next episode, we're going to be diving into those imperatives and why you need to be thinking about this first-party data strategy sooner versus later. I don't want you to get blindsided by things that are happening in the marketplace and caught unaware, so we will spend a little bit more time with those, and there's some of the other topics that we'll be covering soon. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you paying attention. I hope this was useful to you. I welcome any feedback at the email here. If you find this is something that was useful and helpful to you, please go ahead and share. Thanks again, and I'll see you next episode.